I will now deal with the procedure on the termination of employment. Earlier, I took you through the circumstances in which, or the forms in which an employment contract can be brought to an end, can be terminated. Now, let me take you through the procedure on the termination of an employment. This is especially in a situation where the employer decides to terminate the employment contract of an employee on grounds of misconduct or poor performance, particularly grounds of misconduct. Now, in order for the employer to be entitled to terminate the employment contract, the employer must, of course, give reasonable notice to the employee. So, for example, where the employee has committed an act of misconduct, say, for example, the employee has committed theft at the workplace. The employee has taken property or monies belonging to the company. So the employer now wants to terminate the employee. Before doing so, the employer should give reasonable notice to the employee of his act of misconduct. And the employee should be given an opportunity to be heard. So, for example, as an employer, you have found that this employee has committed a misconduct, has committed theft, as I mentioned, and you want to terminate him. Before doing so, you should give him notice that he has committed an act of misconduct, he has committed theft, and you should also give him an opportunity to explain or an opportunity to be heard, okay, on why he or she did such an act before you exercise your right of termination. And of course, the employer must also carry out a proper investigation. You must be extremely sure that that particular employee has committed the act of theft. There must be evidence to show that that employee has committed theft. If you don't have proper evidence, then you wouldn't have a right to terminate. And if you do so, as mentioned earlier, your termination could be found to be unlawful. And some organizations will, of course, have an employee handbook. This employee handbook may set out procedures in which the procedures on how an employee should be terminated. Should there be an act of misconduct or should there be poor performance? Then such procedures as prescribed under the employee handbook should be adhered to, should be followed by the employer. Now, coming to the point of giving notice to the employee who has committed an act of misconduct or who has been guilty of poor performance, the notice to be given is usually called a notice to show cause. This is the starting point before the employer takes any disciplinary action, including termination of the employment. Okay, what should this notice of show cause set out? This notice should set out the alleged misconduct by the employee and set out, or if it's a situation of poor performance, set out details of the employee's poor performance. So now just say it's a misconduct, and I come back to my example, the employee has committed theft. So your notice of show cause to the employee should set out details like what act of theft was committed. So for example, if the employee has stolen money from the company, you should set out when this act was committed, how much was stolen, and any other details pertaining to this act of theft. And for example, you have evidence showing that he or she has committed this act of theft. Like say, for example, there is CCTV footage. Maybe you can refer to that in your notice as well. And like I mentioned, the employer should provide reasonable opportunity to the employee to furnish a reply, to state his or her views on the allegations raised against him or her. And the notice should also set out a time period for the employee to respond to the allegations. Normally, the notice of show cause will provide the employee maybe with a 7-day time period or maximum 14-day time period to respond to the allegations raised against him or her. And if the employee fails to furnish a reply within the time period stipulated, provided the time period is reasonable, then the employer may proceed to make a decision, and this includes taking disciplinary action such as possible termination of the employment if it is warranted. And in a situation where the employee has committed an act of misconduct, like theft, for example, and after you have given notice to the employee, if the employee admits to having committed this act of theft, then the employer has an automatic right to terminate the employment of the employee because the employee has already admitted to committing such an act of misconduct. Now, in cases of serious misconduct, such as theft, or even in situations where there is, say, for example, sexual harassment at work, before you terminate the before you terminate the employee, you may want to conduct a thorough investigation. During this period, when the investigation is carried out, you may suspend the employee because you don't want any interference with the investigation. But suspension pending inquiry, suspension pending investigation should only be carried out in fit and proper cases. Not in every case you should suspend the employee, only in cases of serious misconduct where a detailed investigation needs to be carried out and the time needs to be taken for this investigation, then you may suspend the employee during this period. And usually the period of suspension should not be longer than 1 or 2 weeks. You should be able to complete your investigations within a maximum of 2 weeks. And if an employee is suspended for an indefinite period or for an unduly lengthy period, then the suspension could be deemed to be unreasonable and it could be a breach by the employer. So be very careful. If you intend to suspend your employee pending investigation, try to keep it quick, maximum 1 to 2 weeks, conclude your investigation, and then you take the necessary steps moving forward, or else your suspension could be deemed to be unreasonable. And if you suspend your employee during the period of suspension, the employee should still be paid his wages, at least half of his basic wages. And for example, in certain situations where you need to suspend the employee for more than 2 weeks, say, for example, 3 weeks or 4 weeks, then it is recommended that the employee be paid his full wages after the initial period of 2 weeks. This is set up, for example, under Section 14 sub 2 of our Employment Act 1955. And if the inquiry or the investigation does not disclose any misconduct on the part of the employee, then the employer must restore the employee to the full amount of the wages which was withheld during the period of investigation. However, ladies and gentlemen, in the interest of fair labor practice, it is advisable, it is encouraged that even during the period of suspension, an employee be paid in full, including all his benefits that he's entitled to under his employment contract. Now, I will very quickly deal with domestic inquiry. Okay, what is a domestic inquiry? A domestic inquiry is an internal investigation process conducted by the employee on the conduct of the employee, conducted by the employer on the conduct of the employee. And a domestic inquiry is usually conducted in cases involving serious misconduct by the employee. And a domestic inquiry is basically a domestic hearing, a hearing conducted by the employer. The employer will sit down with the employee. The employer will then set out the details of the acts of misconduct against the complaint against the or raised against the employee. The employer will adduce all the evidence in support of those allegations, and the employee will then be given an opportunity to respond to all these allegations. And once this is complete, the employer can then make the necessary decision whether to terminate the employee, whether to suspend the employee, or if it is shown that the employee actually did not commit the act of misconduct, or the employee has a satisfactory response to the allegations, then maybe the employer may just drop those complaints, and the employee can then continue his or her employment with the company. When conducting a domestic inquiry, the employee should be notified of the date, time, and venue of the hearing. And like mentioned, the employer must notify the employee of the complaints or the charges framed against him prior to the conduct of the hearing. So the employee has advance notice of the complaints made out against him, so that he or she has sufficient time to prepare a response and to address these issues during the domestic inquiry hearing. And like mentioned earlier also, the complaints, the charges must contain full particulars, including the time and place of the alleged misconduct against the employee, or the alleged misconduct by the employee. During a domestic inquiry, the parties must appear in person and cannot be represented by a lawyer. This is not a court. This is just a hearing within the confines of the organization. It's an internal process. So the employer and the employee cannot be represented by lawyers. They must be personally represented. And during the hearing, the employer, like I mentioned earlier, will first present its case. If the employer has any witnesses or evidence to establish the charges against the employee, this will be presented. And thereafter, the employee will be given an opportunity to respond to the charges against him. Sorry, I think there's a slight typo error in the slides. It should be against him. When this domestic inquiry is conducted, the employer will usually form a panel of maybe 3 persons consisting of the upper management of the company, who will be tasked with investigating, who will be tasked with conducting this domestic inquiry and making an appropriate decision. And once the hearing is concluded, this inquiry panel will make a decision on whether the charges framed against the employee has been proven on a balance of probabilities. And if the panel finds that the employee has indeed committed misconduct, it must then mete out the appropriate punishment, which should be commensurate with the circumstances of the case. The punishment that can be imposed by the inquiry panel includes termination or perhaps demotion of the employee, suspension of the employee, or a lighter punishment if it's a less serious offense. So lighter punishment such as a warning. An employee who is dissatisfied with the decision of the inquiry panel may appeal against the decision made. And if there is an appeal, the appeal may be heard by another inquiry panel, another independent inquiry panel. The panel who heard the original or who conducted the original domestic inquiry cannot hear the appeal. It must be by another set of by another panel. It must be heard by another panel of the company.